Do you ever wonder why you're landing interviews but not getting job offers? In this video, I'm going to reveal why your communication skills, not your qualifications, might be the reason why you're not getting that job. I've spent years working at companies like Google, Lyft, Uber, and TikTok, and I've seen firsthand how clear communication can either make or break your chances of getting hired. And of course, I'm going to ask you to stay and watch this whole video because duh, watch time. But in all seriousness, I'm going to be giving some tips on effective communication styles that will help you be a better communicator in your interviews. So hopefully it'll get you that much closer to your next job offer. Now, here's why clear communication is really important. So you may have the most perfect resume, but if you're not able to articulate your value to a business verbally when you're in interviews, you're not going to get that job offer. So here's what you need to do. Imagine you're trying to solve a puzzle, but you don't have the box that the puzzle came in. In fact, maybe it came in like a clear plastic bag. And so you spread out all the pieces, and what you do is you just start picking up random pieces and try to put it together. That's not a really good strategy. A better strategy for trying to solve this puzzle is you start with the edge pieces, you match them up, then you start working in towards the middle. And that's exactly what you need to do in your job interviews, because when you're in your interview, these interviewers don't know them. And fun fact, when you're in interviews, oftentimes interviewers will probably look at your resume just a few minutes before your interview even starts. So they don't know you. You're like pieces of a puzzle in a bag. And so what you need to do is you need to start out with the framework, like the puzzle. Start with the edge pieces, then you work your way into the center, so that way they can build that full picture of who you are. Now let's talk about communication mistakes before we talk about techniques. Now, the biggest mistake that I see that candidates make is that they start using unnecessary jargon or terminology that the interviewer may or may not know about. Now, there are going to be times when you're going to use acronyms that are specific to your industry. So if you're talking to somebody who's also a subject matter expert like yourself, then yes, it's perfectly fine to use those type of acronyms or that jargon because they know what you're talking about. But if you start saying things like, if you start using vocabulary, language, jargon that's specific to, let's say, your own company, and the person that's interviewing you has no idea what you're talking about, it's just going to sound like gobbledygook. And, if they're a good interviewer, they may ask for clarity and say, hey, you mentioned this, like, what does that mean? Then you're going to have to clarify, right? Now, that's what we call ineffective communication because you're not thinking about your audience. So what you have to do is actually think about your audience when you're in your interview, when you're communicating, and remember what they may or may not know. Another mistake that a lot of candidates make is what I'm doing right now, which is speaking very, 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 very fast.
All right. Okay, take it easy.
I don't speak very, 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 very fast by nature, so this is kind of tough for me. But in general, if you're speaking too quickly, you need to slow down just a bit. So in a recent interview, comedian Jimmy Carr talked about how the ideal speaking tempo is 92 beats per minute.
Speak at 92 beats a minute. There's kind of a science behind it, but most great public speakers, it doesn't matter how fast they're speaking, but they're kind of hitting 92 beats a minute.
Now remember, when you rush, you're going to lose your listener. And also make sure that you are projecting your voice. So when you're in your interview, make sure that you're sitting up straight, shoulders back and down, chest lifted, so that way you can project your voice appropriately. Because if you're slouching, if you're nervous, if you're cold, now granted, some offices are really cold, so I totally understand this. So again, try to dress in layers, dress appropriately. That way it won't be as much of an issue. But what we want to do is we want to be able to project our voices out. So that way, again, we're able to be heard because we want to be as clear as possible. Okay, now that we've talked about mistakes, let's talk about how to actually build good communication skills. So think about when you're constructing an answer to a question, think of it like building steps on a staircase, okay? If you're building steps on a staircase, those steps need to be even. The actual steps themselves, right? They need to be even. And they can't be tilted, right? They have to be balanced. They have to be even. That way, when you're climbing up the staircase, it's nice and smooth. So each step needs to be aligned and logically connected to the next step. That way, it'll be easier for other people to follow. Now, my favorite technique when it comes to building out answers, so this is more of the middle part of the technique, not the beginning or the end part, but in the middle, when you are giving an answer, I like to use if-then statements. Now, if you're watching this and you're a programmer or you've coded before, you'll understand this concept. So when you use an if-then statement, you're adding logic to your answer. What you're saying is you start with if. So if this, then the next thing, okay? Now, instead of saying, I think this strategy will work, reframe that and say, if we apply this strategy, then we should see a 20% increase in efficiency. Then once you've said that, then you can add maybe another if-then statement if it's applicable. So what you can do is you can link if-then statements from one to the other. So for example, in this case, if we apply this strategy, then we'll see a 20% increase in efficiency. If we do this, then this will happen. If we do this, then this will happen, right? If then, and if then, and if then. Now, another technique you can use is if you want to boil things down to just one point, after you've explained your answer, after you've said if then, or maybe just one if then, wrap it up with one clear takeaway. So for example, if you're talking about how you improve processes at work, you can end it with something like, the new process saved us 15 hours a week. So with the if-then statements, you are giving a brief explanation of what you talked about, and then you follow it up with that one takeaway. This is going to make it easier for the listener to remember your main idea. So here's a bonus tip. When you are speaking, you want to be speaking in downspeak, meaning you don't want to speak in questions. What do I mean by that? Well, in the English language, when you're asking a question, you tend to inflect upwards at the end of your sentence. So, for example, if I ask you, how was your day? Upspeak, I go up at the end of the sentence. Now, if I say, how is your day? And I downspeak, that has a very different tonality to it. So, subconsciously, here's what happens when you speak in upspeak. You're speaking in questions. When you speak in questions, the listener, the interviewer, is going to have more questions about the things you're saying, and they're going to question what you're saying. And you don't want to add question marks in their head, right? Instead, you want to downspeak at the end of your sentences. That way, again, you're very clear about what you're communicating. Also, if you're not subscribed to my channel, why aren't you? If you're enjoying this content, give it a like, write a comment, let me know some takeaways that you've gotten from this video. Lets me know that you like this type of content and really helps my channel. So thank you. Let's say you're trying to reach a destination and you have a choice of either using Google or Apple Maps, or you go to the destination's website and they have some directions that you can print out. So you print out the directions and you're like, you know what? I'm just gonna use the printed directions because I wanna jam out to some music on my phone. I don't really wanna have my music interrupted by directions. Okay. So you're driving, you have your directions, but let's say the website didn't quite update their directions because they were, they forgot that they even had it on their website, and you might get lost because you don't know where you are. Using a GPS on your phone that's up to date is very different than having instructions where it's not really clear about where you're going because things may have changed. So it's the same when you're speaking. So when you're speaking, you want to speak clearly. You want to be very clear about where you are currently, where you're taking your passenger, and the direction that you're going. You're not going to be taking a bunch of loops and going around in places because that's going to take too long, right? So what you want to do is go from point A to point B as clear and straightforward as possible so you can get to your destination. So when you're at home and you're practicing your interview questions, what you can do is, ask yourself a question, and when you give an answer, try starting with the end in mind. So instead of starting with those if-then statements, begin with the end point. Like, where's the place that we want to go, right? So like you're in your app, you're on your phone, and you plug in the address of where you want to go. That's beginning with the end in mind, right? Same concept. So do that when you are practicing your interview questions. And once you do that, then you can add your if-then statements. So, okay, so this was the question, starting with the end in mind, then you go down the if-then statements. Now, don't do any if-then-else statements because that just takes you way off course and might get you in the gutter, okay? Stick with the if-then. Then, again, once you get to the end, so you started with the end, you're gonna end with the end, right? You reached your destination, then wrap it up in a pretty little bow with that singular statement. Now imagine you're Megan Thee Stallion, her fabulous self, riding in the car, feeling on par because you're a fabulous star. Listen, I know that sounded weird, but I promise you the visual chef's kiss will help you out. So let's talk about interview frameworks. Let's start with the STAR method. This is the classic method of how to answer questions. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. Now, what's really nice about the STAR framework is that it is a complete framework. So that way, as you're answering questions, when you start with the end in mind, then you can begin with the situation. You can then, once you've described the situation, move on to the task that you completed, talk about the actions that you did, and then end it with those results. Now, another method that you can use to answer questions is the CAR method, which stands for challenge, action, results. Now, if someone asks you a question about any challenges or adversities that you've had, this is a really good framework to use because you can begin with the challenge. But again, just like we discussed before, use the same framework. So start with the end in mind, describe the challenge. You're going to describe the challenge, use your if-then statements, end it with wrapping it up in the bow. And then finally, there's the PAR method, which is problem, action, result. This framework is a streamlined way of discussing a problem that you solved and how you moved through it. Again, use the if-then statements, wrap it up in a pretty bow. You can also add a takeaway or summarize the key lesson or benefit that you brought to the organization. Now, as a bonus tip, one of the things that candidates often overlook is when they're giving answers to questions, they're not inserting any evidence at all, either their own experience. You'd be really surprised. Some people talk super high level when it comes to their answers. You should never do that. You should get really deep into the weeds and talk about with as much detail as necessary for the interviewer to understand the entire situation and build that picture. And I know we've discussed that in other videos that I've made. So this communication strategy is something that's really overlooked, and that is including evidence in your answers. Here's what I mean by that. Now, evidence could be something that's internal. So again, when you're talking about a situation, you're actually describing internally like who the stakeholders were, what were the reports, what were those details. So more evidence. So you can either talk about it internally, or you can even use external evidence and say, according to XYZ report, I was able to pull data from this report and leverage that information to work on this problem that I was working on, just as an example, right? You can use outside publications, you can say the news, whatever that is, that someone can actually think about and latch onto as evidence of, oh, this person actually did some outside research. They may actually look up that research as well. And based on that, realize, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. So what this does is it shifts the focus of what you think to what you know. So framing your responses with evidence will boost your credibility and make you appear much more confident in your answers. Also, if you have an interview with a recruiter, be sure to watch this video where I reveal a lot of secrets that recruiters are not going to tell you that will definitely help you move you forward in the interview process. Now, if you're still frustrated and you're not quite sure why you're not getting hired, check out this next video where I give a lot of honest advice about why you're probably not getting hired.